that was a story based on the actual lives of Willie Mosconi and Minnesota Fats, who were two of the world's most famous billiards players.
Hmm.
And Willie Mosconi was asked one time by a reporter, so what do you attribute your success to? You always seem to have everything figured out so that you win almost every time you go out there. And he said, when I'm lining up my shot, I'm not thinking of where it's going to land. I'm thinking 3 shots ahead. When I hit the ball, where does that land? How does that position me for the next shot? And when that lands, how does that position me for the third shot? So that's what I like, the people on my team to think about strategically. This is what sourcing is. It's not, can you get us something today? It's about, well, if I do this, how does that impact things in the future? And how could that be leveraged further?
Thank you so much for joining another edition of The Never Ending Climb for a Stronger Supply Chain and Procurement. Today, I've got the pleasure of being joined by Kevin Giblin. And Kevin is a passionate procurement pro across regulated, heavy industries, services. He's seen it, he's done it, he's been there. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today.
A pleasure to be here today, Sean. I'm looking forward to talk about something I'm extremely passionate about. People find this hard to believe, but I love procurement.
That's amazing. It's important to love what we do because we got to keep showing up for all the people that depend on us.
That is true.
And I love this idea of how the operating model for procurement is shifting, isn't it? It's not the same as it always was. It's not just purchasing of go get me more pens or make sure I've got the steel I need. There's so much more to that. What can you share about how the operating model for procurement is shifting these days?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sean. So I think it began as a very tactical and procedural role, right? And like you said, go get me a pen. And unfortunately, the business perception still has that mindset in some corners of the business world, but that's up to us to change that mindset. We have become very strategic and moving very much away from the traditional viewpoint of what procurement does, and that's save money. Should we still be saving the company money? Absolutely. But it's much, much more than that. It's evolved into much more strategic, personal, and well-rounded role. And we can kind of get into that more as we talk about that.
Yeah, there's so much more to it. And, I love the way there are so many people who still don't really know what is procurement.
That's so true. Matt, it's one of the few professions where if you're at a dinner party and people talk about what they do, this person's a lawyer, great, understand what that is. This person maybe is in sales or in advertising. But if you tell someone you're in procurement, people kind of look the other way and they kind of twiddle their thumbs like, what the heck is that? What does that mean?
It's not quite as bad as saying you're an actuairi figuring out statistically how long
that is true. That is true.
It's a few notches above that, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, don't even get me started on what my kids make fun of me. So did you have a good day sourcing today? That's a whole other story. But what I tell, I've had this internship program that I've run for a number of years, and what I tell the interns coming in is that you have an opportunity to decide what you want to do with your career. But let me tell you what procurement actually is versus what people think it is. It is the only career profession that I can think of that whether you like finance, advertising, sales, customer service, relationship management, creative writing, it's the only one that takes all of those as part of its daily function. And so that's what I find exciting about. There's never a dull moment in procurement.
Never a dull moment is for sure. And especially when supply chain disruptions are happening or any other significant shifts in geopolitics and so on are making things tricky. I think this is where that sense of it used to be about purchasing or procurement, and there's this shift, greater emphasis on value.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Sean. So, the one of the things that I can share that kind of resonates about that point is sourcing, which is a subset of procurement. You didn't even find that in existence as a word or terminology until sometime in the mid-90s. And so that kind of shows how the procurement profession has changed as, quite frankly, a microcosm of the business world. As business changes, so does procurement. Accountants have always been accountants and always will be accountants. Lawyers will always be lawyers, and nothing's going to change that. But our role, our function has changed dramatically from its early infancy of buying pens to now finding contingency plans and finding offshore resources and developing AI functionality to make things more efficient for businesses. And that's not what the prior generation of procurement was all about. So we keep changing. And I think the other thing too is the chief procurement officer title, the CPO. Um, I could see that going away to becoming a chief value officer, which really is more about what we do. So there you have it. You heard it from me first.
It's the element of optimization, isn't it? And it's
Yeah,
the making sure that the dollars that are generated are not just straight bottom line dollars. Sometimes they influence, reinforce, and support the top line in new ways.
that's right.
One of my favorite stories is a chemical company that when supply became super tight, they recognized it wasn't just about purchasing, it wasn't price, it wasn't savings, it was supply. And without the supply, there's not a lot of top line revenue. And where all of their competitors were saying, hey, don't you dare increase your prices, things are tight right now. This one company said, ship me double, don't care about the price.
Mm,
Guess
hmm.
whose market share doubled, right?
That's right. That's
That's the
right.
difference between a purchasing function and a value-based strategic partner for the business that's focused on value. Because forgetting the top line is pretty easy, isn't it? Man,
Absolutely.
one of the other things that I know is tricky is when you're negotiating something, you sometimes need to source things like Bloomberg terminals, but
Mm.
there's only one place to get one of those. What advice would you have for leaders and emerging leaders out there when you're dealing with a supplier who has just about all the cards, or there's only one source where you can get that thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's two ways to look at it. One is you have to think outside the box. Don't think like a purchasing agent. Think like a strategic component of your organization. And what do I mean by that? So we spend X number of dollars. We're not really changing the contract. We renew it every year, keep the same licenses. But is that the right model? Do we need these licenses or do you need all of those licenses? Are we using it the right way? Could we be leveraging it further? So it's kind of thinking outside the box. So it's that the one component of it is the thinking outside the box. The other part that I want people to think about is I call this the Willie Moscone principle. Now, for those who may know, and even for those who may not know, there was a movie called The Color of Money, which starred Paul Newman and Robert Redford, I believe. And that was a story based on the actual lives of Willie Moscone and Minnesota Fats, who were two of the world's most famous billiards players.
Hmm.
And Willie Moscone was asked one time by a reporter, so what do you attribute your success to? You always seem to have everything figured out so that you win almost every time you go out there. And he said, when I'm lining up my shot, I'm not thinking of where it's going to land. I'm thinking three shots ahead. When I hit the ball, where does that land? How does that position me for the next shot? And when that lands, how does that position me for the third shot? So that's what I like, the people on my team to think about strategically. This is what sourcing is. It's not, can you get us something today? It's about, well, if I do this, how does that impact things in the future? And how could that be leveraged further? And optimization, you mentioned that earlier, Sean. That's one of the words I used because, by the way, I know we live in acronyms in procurement.
Yeah,
There is an acronym people don't realize that the word sourcing is an acronym.
love this.
And
Do
if you like, I can share you what that means.
please, absolutely.
Strategic optimization, understanding, researching, collaborating, innovation, negotiating for gain share.
I
There
like
you
that.
have it.
I think that element of collaborating is so underrated. And I think the negotiations experts out there in the world would, I'm sure, agree that when you can both come out with something that is good for both folks, that both parties, that creates that stronger supply chain that I know we're all looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. When you mentioned about when you have a supplier that's a sole source, single source, they're two different things, but they're similar that you only have the one. It's how can you find a situation where that supplier says, you know what, I like having this customer, and they don't want to lose that customer. And if that happens, then you are going to get a better deal.
Yeah.
I can give you an example. There was one time where we were negotiating a contract for a contingent staffing contract, and that supplier had other customers with significantly more volume of spend than we had. I mean, we weren't even close to being one of the top 10, but we were able to negotiate getting into what they called their President's Club of their top tier customers. And the reason why we were able to is because the business sector we were in and our brand name was attractive for them to put on their presentation deck and say, hey, look, we have this customer. So
Yep.
there's always something that you can look to leverage.
Yeah. That ability to go and say, hey, if we can go tell the world together a story of how much value we helped you create, that's often something that suppliers are grateful and willing to trade around.
Yes, 100%.
That's awesome. One of the other things that we were exploring was this idea that metrics matter, and yet sometimes, depending on who you're talking to, they might not care.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true. I think that's one of the things that procurement can sometimes fall on the sword when you're having a conversation with your CFO and you're telling your CFO about things that mean nothing to them. If you're going to tell them about savings, of course, they're going to perk up and listen to that. But if you tell them about how much spend you're managing or what percentage of your suppliers make up 20% of your supply base, they don't care. Um, so you have to tailor to your audience. So if I think about a metric like payment terms extended, that matters because it highlights the value of what you're doing to the balance sheet, it improves cash flow, and it reduces AP backlog. And who does that resonate with? Well, finance leaders, the CFO, of course, and AP. But that doesn't matter to someone who's in sales, for example. What matters to them? Cycle time improvements. So if you go speed to market quicker because of the RFP efficiencies, that means you're going to work with that supplier faster, and your sales team is going to say, that's great. I'm going to come to you every time I have a need because you've helped me get business going sooner with that supplier. So it's knowing your audience and presenting metrics that matter to them.
Yeah. And I think that's, I mean, for any department, know your audience and the message sent, message received, and what matters to them, what's in it for them is so easy to miss. And I think the other part that goes with that is the language that's used within procurement is sometimes its own little bubble, right? If you go and you say, well, we've got a
Yes.
sourcing event, and then you
Yes.
say that to somebody in sales, they're like, a what? Or you go
Exactly.
to somebody else outside of procurement and you talk about some of the key metrics or key drivers or key processes, and somebody says, I'm sorry, a category strategy? I don't know what that means.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
all of a sudden you're speaking a different language to somebody in your own company. And it's sometimes counterintuitive, but that's one of the things that I know gets in the way of teams over and over and over again is, well, the last time I talked to procurement, they were talking something about a policy and a category strategy. I don't know. I just needed to buy this thing.
Yeah.
And that feeling can get reinforced when an excited new compliance leaning team member is suddenly talking policy and compliance and category strategy to their partner in the business who's, listen, I just need some MRO parts, please.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, we fall into this trap of we live in a world of acronyms in procurement. I mentioned earlier, so you have the NDA, MSA, SOW, LOI, SLA, KPI, and the business partners, their heads are spinning, going, what the heck does all that mean?
Yeah. Let's just speak English to each other. And then
Exactly.
what does that mean? Because it means that you're thinking about and empathizing with that other party. And the same thing for suppliers too. Because if you're going through a strategic sourcing event and you go to all of your suppliers and you're grinding all of them on price, then if you're not careful, you can end up weakening your own supply chain by making yourself an unattractive customer for them too. And that
Yeah,
understand what matters and how far to push or pull or test things.
that's
Super,
right.
super important. I love that.
Yeah.
Origin story, Kevin. I've heard that you had an interesting evolution into your role in procurement. If you have a moment, can you share with us a little bit
Y-
more about how
Sure.
did you get here?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. It is, I mean, like most people that are in this profession, they probably started out doing something else, and that definitely rings true here. So I was working for a small investment banking company in Lower Manhattan, and that company was acquired by a large French financial institution. And during that process, or I should step back, before that happened, I was wearing several hats. So I came on board to be their records manager. I had done that in my prior job and setting up their records management system, the archival periods and all that stuff. And then my boss said, "Hey, you know what? You're a young guy. Can you kind of help us out with facility stuff?" And so I started helping out with plotting out the moves, and I learned how to do the blueprint planning and the floor planning and stuff. And he said, along that, sometimes we got to buy some things. So can you help us purchase some stuff? I said, sure, I could do that too. So remember, it's a small company. I'm wearing these three hats. So then we get acquired by this French large company, and as luck would have it, and I do say as luck would have it, the person I was reporting into was the head of administrative services at this large bank, and he was based in Midtown. And so I actually became the very first person from the company acquired to move to Midtown. And so lucky me, I suppose, right?
Right on.
So I'm sitting there and I'm kind of doing all these things, and I'm in my little cubicle, and he calls me up on the phone. He says, "Can you stop by and see me at the corner office?" I was like, "Geez, I just got here. Already I'm getting let go." I go into his office, and let me preface this by saying, he had worked previously at GE under Jack Welch. So he actually worked for Jack Welch directly. So that was a great, a great role model.
Yeah.
He says, he says to me, and this was his exact words in this way. He said, "Purchasing, records management, facilities. Pick one." And I said, "Purchasing?" And he said, "Good choice. That's all you're doing from now on." And so he kind of gave me the directional guidance, and I think he wanted me to pick that one. And so I did, and so here I am.
That, all of that from a split second decision when offered three options. Door
Yeah,
number one,
absolutely.
door number two, door number three.
Yeah, and I don't know what possessed me to pick that of the three, but for some reason I thought it had the most opportunity to change going forward. And I'm I don't like doing the same thing all the time. I have work ADHD. I've got to find something different and challenging.
Speaking my language, Kevin. Squirrel. Um, this is well, as is the case for a lot of people who start companies. I guess it's a common thread. When you were thinking about records management as a path, what were you imagining? I'm imagining you're kind of looking at three doors and briefly exploring all three of them. What did you see behind the records management door?
So the one thing that was interesting about that is I had in one of my very first jobs, I was working for a service company that did the processing of information for the Screen Actors Guild of all places.
Yeah.
And the Screen Actors Guild was one of our key customers. They had said, "You know what? We get all these actors that call up and want to know about the residual payments and their royalties, and we can't find any of this information. We got to organize ourselves better." So they had asked me, they said, "Hey, we're thinking of creating a new role. Are you interested?" And now I'm pretty young in my career, and I'm thinking, well, it'd be cool to work with the Screen Actors Guild anyway, so yes, I'll take it. And
Yeah.
so I became their very first records manager. And so I was kind of thinking, well, this could be a pretty nice career for me. But then I had moved on. I got this other opportunity and said, well, now I'm doing facilities too. That's kind of interesting too, and that's different. And they asked me to do purchasing. I said, now I know what to do. I got all three of these things that I like.
Now you get to focus.
Yeah,
And focus is a gift too. That's amazing. I
exactly.
love the way that split second, it's a who question, right? Because that leader, that time, thought about who am I going to ask first, and they asked you first, and
Yeah.
that's always a compliment too. If they had a whole team full of people that they could have asked,
Yeah.
and you
A hundred
you
hundred
got
percent.
first call.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's always an amazing feeling to look back on it. And that leader, you're in that role now. And so, these years later, you get to be the person that creates the opportunities for that next generation, for those interns, for those early career, early talent individuals. That's one of the greatest gifts I think that we get to
Uh,
have is
yeah.
to
I agree, Sean. Yeah.
being that person that creates the spark, creates the opportunity, and then says, yeah, let's go. I love that. That whole circle continues.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. I think the one thing that's often overlooked, if you're a leader in procurement, one of the key assets you can bring to emerging talent is those experiences because that's not something that's found in a textbook or a case study. It's living and breathing examples of, hey, this is something that I have experienced. Let me share this with you. Use it as you may, but it's just going to give you an example of how things can evolve and change.
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing. Kevin, grateful for your time, your wisdom, your experience, and for sharing this with the community today. Kevin, thank you so much. We really appreciate you.
My pleasure, Sean. Thank you for having me.
And then for everybody watching, this is another edition of The Never Ending Climb for a Stronger Supply Chain and Procurement. We'll see you next week.
Have a great day.